everything moved according to his command, and nothing ever felt out of reach. For years, he was known as the richest man in the city, a man whose name alone made businessmen nervous and politicians respectful. People feared him more than they respected him, and Ethan believed that fear was enough to keep his world under control. His mansion stood like a palace on the hill, with shining floors, giant glass windows, luxury cars parked like trophies, and workers who moved around quietly, never daring to look him in the eye. His company, Hale Industries, was the heart of the city's economy, and everyone believed it would stay on top forever. But the world Ethan had built with pride and power began to crack on a quiet morning that started like any other. He woke up expecting another normal day of meetings, profits, and decisions that only a man like him could make. Instead, the moment he stepped out of his bedroom, the halls of the mansion felt unusually cold, as if the building itself knew something terrible before he did. Ethan shrugged it off until a loud buzz came from one of the giant screens in his living room. The breaking news headline flashed in bright red letters, cutting through the silence like a knife. Ethan Hale accused of fraud. All assets frozen. For a moment, Ethan thought it must be a mistake, a technical glitch, or a bad joke. But the report continued, growing worse with every word. Financial records had been leaked. Documents showed missing funds, and government officials confirmed a full investigation. Ethan felt the ground beneath him tilt. He grabbed his phone and tried calling his business partner, Adrian Cross, the man he trusted with more than half of his empire. No answer. He called again. Still nothing. A cold fear spread through him, a feeling he was not used to, and he began to understand something was wrong, deeply wrong. By the time he reached his office, the mansion gates were overflowing with reporters pushing against each other, shouting his name, begging for a statement, pointing cameras at every window. The workers in his house began to panic. Some whispered to each other. Others quickly packed their things and slipped out the back doors, leaving without even collecting their full pay. Calls poured in from board members, lawyers, and executives, all frantic. All asking if he knew what happened, all pretending to care, even though Ethan could hear the fear in their voices. Noon had not even arrived yet, but Ethan's life had already begun to collapse. Documents started appearing online showing transfers he had never approved. Bank accounts he never touched were being linked to him. The city watched as the mighty Ethan Hale fell faster than anyone had expected. But amid the chaos, only two people in the mansion stayed exactly where they always were. Mrs. Lila, the old maid who had served the Hale family for almost 20 years, and her quiet daughter, Mira, who usually kept her eyes down, her voice soft, and her presence almost invisible. Ethan barely noticed them on normal days, but today, everything felt different. As he stood in the hallway trying to make sense of his world falling apart, he caught Myra watching him from the staircase. Not with fear, not with pity, but with something he could not describe. Her eyes were calm, almost too calm for the situation around them. And for a brief second, Ethan felt as if she knew something he didn't. Myra quickly looked away when she noticed him staring back. But the expression on her face stayed in Ethan's mind like a puzzle piece that didn't fit anywhere yet. The mansion grew louder as phones rang nonstop. Security guards shouted instructions, and workers rushed out with their bags. Ethan tried to gather important documents from his office, but his hand shook each time he picked something up. His thoughts felt heavy, his chest tight, and he wondered how his entire fortune could crumble in a single morning. He had always believed his success was too strong to break, too solid to fail. But now, even the walls of his home felt like they were closing in on him. Outside, the sound of cameras clicking grew louder as more reporters arrived. They yelled questions about the fraud accusations, shouted assumptions about his guilt, and filmed every movement near the mansion. Ethan knew he had to speak at some point, but he could barely speak to himself. As he walked through the once quiet hallways, he caught Myra watching him again, this time from near the kitchen. She stood very still, her hands clasped together, her eyes following him with that same strange focus. Ethan tried to ignore it, convincing himself she was just confused or surprised like everyone else. But the way she studied him made his stomach twist. Before he could approach her, the sharp sound of sirens filled the air. 2 police cars rolled up the driveway, their red and blue lights flashing against the mansion walls. The officers stepped out, serious and focused, moving toward the door with purpose. The workers who were still inside froze. Mrs. Lila gasped and covered her mouth. Myra took a slow breath but didn't look afraid, only more alert. Ethan stepped forward, confused and angry, unsure if they were here to arrest him, question him, or take something else from him. But as the officers reached the front entrance, Ethan noticed Myra's eyes shift toward him again, filled with something unsettling, something between warning and urgency. It was then he realized the strange feeling that had been growing in his chest since morning. Myra wasn't just watching him. She knew something. Something important. Something he wasn't prepared for. And the police were only the first wave of what was coming next. As the police entered the mansion, Ethan stood in the center of the hallway, trying to keep his breathing steady, even though his world felt like it was spinning out of control. The officers did not arrest him, but they questioned him with sharp, firm voices that left no space for confusion. They asked about the missing company funds, the forged documents, and his partner Adrian Cross. Ethan answered everything as honestly as he could. But the officers kept writing notes with tight expressions, as if the truth was a puzzle they weren't sure he could solve. After almost an hour of questioning, they finally told him he had 24 hours to leave the mansion. All of his properties, cars, accounts, and valuables would soon be seized by the government until the investigation ended. 24 hours. The number hit Ethan like a hammer. He had lived in this mansion since his 20s. He had built every part of it with pride, thinking he would grow old inside its luxury. Now he had one day left in the place he once ruled like a king. When the police left, the mansion fell into a heavy silence. Even the ticking of the giant wall clock felt louder. Ethan went to his bedroom and stared at his reflection in the mirror. The man looking back at him didn't look like a billionaire anymore. His face was pale, his hair messy, and his eyes were filled with a fear he couldn't hide. Soon the news spread everywhere. Business partners stopped calling. Investors withdrew support. People who used to praise him now wrote comments online calling him a fraud. His phone, once filled with non-stop messages, now felt like a dead device. But the strangest part of the day was not the reporters or the officers. It was Myra. She kept appearing in corners of the house as Ethan walked through it, packing his belongings. Her eyes followed him with a steady, almost thoughtful gaze, like she was watching both his actions and his emotions. Ethan didn't understand it. She barely spoke to him in all the years she worked there with her mother, so why was she so focused on him now? Mrs. Lila, on the other hand, looked broken. Her hand shook as she folded clothes, and she kept muttering prayers under her breath. Ethan felt a strange guilt when he saw her stress, even though none of this was her fault. When evening arrived, most of the workers had already left. The cooks, the maids, the drivers, and the guards, everyone disappeared, scared of what being connected to Ethan might bring. Only Mrs. Lila and Myra remained, working quietly as if they had already accepted something Ethan had not. He tried calling Adrian again, his business partner, the man he had trusted more than anyone else. But like before, Adrian did not answer. His number was switched off. Ethan felt a burning anger inside him, mixed with a rising fear that Adrian was the one behind everything. As Ethan moved from room to room, choosing what little he could take with him, Myra suddenly stepped forward and handed him a small folder. Ethan stared at it, confused. It was old, dusty, and the corner was torn as if it had been hidden badly. He didn't understand where she found it. Before he could ask, Myra looked at him with those calm, serious eyes and only said one quiet sentence that stayed in his mind. "You should see this." Then she walked away. The folder felt heavier than it looked. Ethan opened it slowly in his office. Inside were papers he thought were destroyed years ago, contracts, signatures, and old financial records from the early days of his company. But one signature on a document caught his eye. It looked like his signature, but not exactly. Something was off. A curve too sharp. A line too straight. His hand froze as a sudden, terrible thought hit him. Someone had forged his signature. Someone had taken advantage of his. Adrian Cross. Ethan felt a cold shock run down his arms. If Adrian forged these papers, then the accusations against Ethan were not just business attacks. They were traps. Calculated traps. He stared at the paper for long minutes, his heart beating faster. But he did not understand how Myra found this folder. Why was it hidden? What made her search for it? Why did she give it to him now, when everything was collapsing? The sun slowly set, leaving the mansion in dim light. Ethan walked to the living room, holding the folder, and saw Mrs. Leela talking quietly to Myra. When they noticed him, Mrs. Leela looked away, wiping her eyes. "We must leave tomorrow," she whispered softly, as if apologizing. "We cannot work without pay. We have no place to go." Ethan nodded weakly. He couldn't blame them. But Myra didn't move. She kept her eyes on Ethan, as if she wasn't ready to leave yet. Her stare felt like it carried meaning Ethan still didn't understand. As midnight approached, Ethan sat alone in the empty mansion with a broken file, a forged signature, and a truth that was slowly becoming clearer. He had 24 hours left, and he had a feeling Myra knew more than she showed. He didn't know why, but he knew this was only the beginning of something much bigger, something dangerous, something that would change everything he thought he knew about his own life. And as the clock continued ticking, Ethan realized that losing his fortune was only the first wave of what was coming. The real storm had not even arrived yet. The next morning arrived with a sadness that hung in the air like fog. Ethan woke early, though he had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Adrian's forged signature, Myra's calm stare, and the flashing lights of the police cars. The mansion, once full of movement and noise, now felt like an empty museum. Dust seemed louder than footsteps. Ethan walked through the halls for the last time, touching the walls he once believed would always belong to him. He had spent years filling the place with expensive art and furniture, but now none of it mattered because he could take none of it with him. His fortune, his pride, and his entire world had been stripped away in one night. Mrs. Lila watched him with quiet sadness as she and Myra carried their small bags toward the door. Mrs. Lila tried to smile at Ethan, but the smile trembled and disappeared. For her, losing her job meant losing safety, food, and everything she depended on. Ethan felt guilty again. He had always seen her as part of the mansion, never as a woman with her own struggles, her own fears. Myra, however, walked slowly behind her mother, steady and calm as always. She kept glancing at Ethan, almost as if she was waiting for something, maybe for him to speak or ask a question. But Ethan still didn't understand the strange look she always gave him. When they stepped outside, Ethan saw the reporters still waiting like hungry wolves. Cameras clicked immediately. Microphones pushed forward. Questions fell over each other. Ethan froze for a moment, feeling exposed and small. Mrs. Lila lowered her head, scared of being recorded. But Myra stood tall, not lowering her eyes for even a second. She looked at the reporters the same way she sometimes looked at Ethan. Calm, focused, almost unreadable. Ethan didn't know why, but her confidence made him feel less alone. They rushed into a taxi before the reporters could block them. Ethan didn't have a destination, and for the first time in his adult life, he had nowhere to go. No hotel would accept him under investigation. No friend answered his calls. His cards were frozen. He had no mansion, no money, no power. Mrs. Lila sat quietly, her hands shaking, while Myra rested a hand on her mother's shoulder. Ethan stared out the window as the huge city he once ruled passed by like a stranger. Expensive restaurants, tall glass buildings, giant billboards with his once powerful company's logo. Everything felt like a lie now. Everything reminded him that he no longer belonged in this world. The taxi driver asked where to go. Ethan couldn't answer. The silence lasted until Myra finally spoke softly and calmly. She told the driver the name of her hometown, a small place far from the city, a place Ethan had never heard of. He looked at her, surprised, but she didn't look back. She just stared ahead, as if she knew this was the only direction left. The drive took hours. The city slowly disappeared behind them, replaced by quiet roads, green fields, and small houses that looked nothing like Ethan's world. When they reached Mira's town, the taxi stopped near a narrow street with simple homes and small shops. Children ran barefoot, old men played cards on broken tables, and neighbors talked loudly across their doors. It felt warm and alive, completely different from Ethan's cold, empty mansion. But to Ethan, it also felt uncomfortable, almost like he didn't know how to stand on this kind of ground. People in the streets stared at him. Some recognized him from the news. Others whispered, wondering why a man who once lived like royalty was standing in their tiny neighborhood looking lost. Mrs. Lila apologized softly, saying this place was all she could offer. Ethan nodded, though he felt embarrassed. He had never lived without luxury. He didn't even know how to live normally. Mira led him to a small room they rented from a neighbor. The room smelled like old wood and had only one bed, a chair, and a dim light bulb. Ethan looked around, stunned. It was smaller than his mansion's bathroom, but it was all he had left. Mira watched him again with that same thoughtful look, as though she was studying how he reacted to this new life. Ethan avoided her eyes, not ready to accept how far he had fallen. After settling her mother, Myra came back to Ethan's room with a small bag of groceries. She told him he needed to learn simple things now because his old life was gone for a while. Ethan felt a sting of pride, but he couldn't deny she was right. She showed him how to boil eggs, how to wash his clothes by hand, and how to buy cheap food from local shops. Ethan felt like a child learning basics for the first time. At night, Mrs. Lila slept peacefully, relieved to be safe. But Myra sat alone on the small porch under a weak streetlight, reading the old folder with Ethan's forged signature. Her face was serious, her brows slightly tightened. She wasn't just helping him settle. She was trying to understand what really happened to him. Ethan stepped outside quietly and saw her studying the papers. A strange mix of worry and curiosity filled him. Why was she doing this for him? She wasn't his friend. She wasn't part of his company. She had no reason to care. But Myra looked up at him with steady eyes and told him something that made his chest tighten. She said nothing here matched the reports. She said someone shaped the evidence too perfectly, almost like they wanted Ethan to fall and never stand again. Ethan felt the weight of her words. Then she added something that sent a chill down his spine. She said that someone in the city already knew he was innocent, but wanted him destroyed before he could prove it. Ethan stared at her in shock. And in that small, quiet town, for the first time since his life collapsed, he felt a new kind of fear. The fear that Mira knew more than she should. And the fear that the danger chasing him was just beginning. Mira woke early the next morning, long before the sun had fully risen, and sat outside the small house with the old folder in her hands. The faint light from the sky touched her face, showing the quiet determination she usually hid. Ethan watched her from the doorway, still confused by her calmness. He had slept poorly, turning over again and again, haunted by the idea that someone had carefully destroyed him. Mira, however, sat still like a person who already accepted the storm and was preparing for the next one. Mrs. Lila moved slowly inside the house, tired from stress and travel. So Myra made breakfast for both of them with simple ingredients: eggs, bread, and tea. Ethan felt awkward, not used to eating simple meals or sitting at a small wooden table, but Mira acted as if nothing was strange. Her quiet confidence made the small home feel less suffocating. When breakfast ended, Mira told her mother she needed to go to the town market, but Ethan noticed she didn't take any shopping bag. Something felt off. He followed her outside. She paused, surprised, but didn't look annoyed. She simply looked at him with those steady eyes that always seemed to hold a secret. Ethan asked her where she was really going, and for a moment, her calm expression softened. She said she needed answers, and the town market was only her excuse. Ethan felt his heart drop. Something important, something that connected to the forged papers in that folder. Ethan tried to warn her. The city was dangerous for him, and maybe even more dangerous for someone like her, someone who didn't have power or money. But Myra only nodded calmly and said that danger did not frighten her. What frightened her more was letting the truth stay buried. Then she walked away before Ethan could say anything else. Ethan watched her leave until she disappeared behind the corner of the street. He felt strangely helpless. He wasn't used to feeling this way. In his old life, he controlled people, decisions, schedules, and money. Now he couldn't control anything, not even the actions of a quiet maid's daughter. Mira boarded a bus that shook loudly as it moved toward the city. She held the old folder tightly against her chest the whole ride. The closer she got to the tall buildings and crowded streets, the more cautious her expression became. She didn't go to the company building first. That would be too obvious. Instead, she went to the old neighborhood where Ethan's company first began. Many of the workers there knew Ethan before he became a billionaire, back when he still smiled, before pride hardened him. Mira moved between narrow streets, asking old shopkeepers and former employees if they remembered anything strange in the past year. Some people recognized Ethan from the news and refused to speak, thinking he was guilty. Others spoke softly, saying they always trusted him. But one older man, a former accountant, told Myra something she didn't expect. He said Adrian Cross, Ethan's partner, had been visiting old records secretly for months. He had taken old files away, files Myra now held in her hands. Mira thanked him and continued moving through the city, gathering every small clue she could. She found patterns Ethan didn't see. Documents signed on dates he was traveling. Files missing without explanation. Transactions created late at night. Every clue pointed to one answer. Someone had framed Ethan with careful planning. Someone who knew the company better than anyone. Someone like Adrian. But Myra didn't stop there. She visited a friend who worked at a small legal office. They looked at the signature again. Her friend confirmed what she had suspected. The signature was definitely forged. The curve of the letters, the pressure of the pen, the angle of the final stroke, everything was slightly different from Ethan's usual writing. Myra's chest tightened. She knew Ethan needed this proof. But she also knew the person who forged the signature wouldn't let this truth spread easily. As she left the legal office, Myra noticed a man across the street watching her. He wasn't pretending. He stared directly at her with sharp eyes, then picked up his phone and whispered something before walking away. Myra's steps slowed. She sensed danger but didn't run. Running would make her a target. Instead, she walked calmly to the nearest bus station, her mind racing. Someone had followed her. Someone connected to Adrian. Someone who saw her searching for answers. Back in the small town, Ethan spent the day pacing around the room, unable to stay still. He tried calling the only liar who hadn't abandoned him, but the liar said things looked bad. Very bad. Ethan needed proof of his innocence, proof he didn't have. He felt powerless, which frightened him more than losing his mansion. As the sun began to set, Ethan sat outside the house, staring down the road, waiting for Myra. Hours passed. The sky darkened. The streetlights flickered on. Mrs. Lila grew worried, pacing in front of the gate. Ethan felt a cold knot in his stomach. Myra should have returned by now. When she finally appeared, walking toward them with tired steps and dust on her clothes, Ethan felt a wave of relief stronger than anything he expected. But Myra's eyes were different. Not calm, not steady. She looked serious, focused, almost shaken, though she tried to hide it. She handed Ethan the folder and told him she had found proof. But then she added something else in a low voice. Someone followed her. Someone who didn't want the truth to come out. Ethan felt the world freeze for a moment. The danger wasn't just about money or reputation anymore. It was about survival. And for the first time, Ethan realized something important. Myra wasn't just helping him. She was risking her life for him. And the real mystery wasn't only who framed him. It was why Myra cared enough to fight for him. When almost everyone else had walked away, Ethan barely slept that night. And when he did, his dreams were filled with blurry shadows and the echo of Myra's words about being followed. The morning arrived heavy and tense, and even the small town felt different, as if the air carried a warning. Myra tried to act normal, helping her mother with morning chores and preparing simple breakfast. But Ethan could see the worry in her eyes, hidden under her calmness. She avoided looking directly at him, not wanting her fear to spread to Mrs. Lila, who was already trembling at every small noise. Ethan held the folder tightly, reading the forged signature again and again until the shapes began to blur. This folder was their only hope. Myra had collected more proof than he could have ever found on his own. But now the danger had grown. Whoever followed Myra would not simply give up. They wanted the truth buried. They wanted Ethan ruined. And they were willing to threaten a girl who had done nothing but search for answers. Ethan felt a sharp anger he hadn't felt since everything fell apart. Not anger because he lost his wealth, but anger because Myra was dragged into a fight that should have been his alone. The day passed slowly. Ethan stayed inside, thinking, planning, worrying. Myra stepped out twice to speak with neighbors and make sure no one suspicious was watching the house. Ethan noticed she kept glancing at every corner, every moving shadow, every stranger passing by. She wasn't just scared. She was prepared. As evening approached, she finally sat beside Ethan in the small room and told him the truth in a quiet voice. She had gone to Adrian's old office, spoken to former workers, and even met someone who claimed to know that the fake transaction started months before Ethan ever saw any signs. She had proof. Real proof. Enough to shake Adrian's lies. Enough to shift the entire investigation. But that same proof had made her a target. Ethan felt both grateful and terrified. He didn't understand why Myra would go this far for him. He wasn't kind to her in the past. He barely noticed her existence. But Myra simply said she believed in truth, and she believed he didn't deserve a punishment built on lies. Night settled over the small town when they heard a car engine rumble from a distance. The sound didn't belong to the usual old vehicles the town used. This one hummed smoothly, like a newer, more powerful car. Ethan stepped to the window and felt his stomach twist. A black car was parked at the end of their street. Its lights were off, and the windows were tinted dark. It didn't belong here. Mira froze beside him. Mrs. Lila whispered a prayer. Ethan's heart began to race. The car didn't move for several minutes. Then slowly, its headlights blinked on. Ethan stepped back from the window, feeling a wave of dread. He looked at Mira, and she nodded once without speaking. She knew what this meant. They were no longer watching from afar. They were coming. Ethan grabbed the folder and stuffed it inside his jacket. Myra whispered that they needed to leave the house immediately. Mrs. Lila tried to protest, but Myra gently told her to stay locked inside and not open the door for anyone. Ethan and Mira rushed out the back door into the narrow alley behind the house. The black car rolled forward slowly, almost silently, stopping in front of the gate. Ethan and Mira hid behind old crates as two men stepped out. They were tall, dressed in dark clothes, and looked around with sharp eyes. Ethan's heart pounded so hard, he worried the men could hear it. Myra's breathing was fast but controlled. She motioned with her hand, guiding Ethan toward the narrow path that led deeper into the neighborhood. They moved quickly but silently, trying not to draw attention. Ethan kept checking behind them, expecting the men to appear any moment. The two men walked closer to the house, knocking loudly on the door. Mrs. Lila didn't answer. Mira pulled Ethan's arm and they ran. The narrow streets twisted like a maze. The small town, which felt warm and safe before, now felt like a trap with too many corners to hide in. Finally, they reached an old shed behind the wall, his chest burning, his mind spinning. Mira watched the street through the small crack in the wood. Her voice shook slightly when she finally spoke. She said she never meant for this to happen, but she also couldn't run away from the truth. Ethan looked at her then, really looked at her, and realized how brave she had been since the beginning. She fought for him when he didn't even fight for himself. She risked everything, not for money or reward, but because she knew someone had to uncover the truth. Suddenly, distant footsteps echoed outside. Ethan froze. Mira held his hand to stop him from moving. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Ethan felt sweat trickle down his neck. The men were searching for the girl who dug too deep. Searching for Ethan. Searching for the folder. Ethan finally understood the danger Myra had been living with since she started investigating. The footsteps stopped outside the shed. A shadow moved across the door. Ethan held his breath until his lungs ached. The shadow lingered, unmoving, as if deciding whether to enter. Finally, after several long seconds, the footsteps moved away. Ethan exhaled shakily. Myra closed her eyes in relief. But the fear didn't fade completely. It only sank deeper. Because now they both knew something for certain. The men were not just following them. They were hunting them. And Mira, brave and determined as she was, had paid a terrible price for trying to help him. Ethan felt something shift inside him then, something stronger than fear. He had lost his fortune. He had lost his name. But he would not lose the one person who stood by him when the entire world turned its back. For the first time since his downfall began, he knew what he had to do next. He had to fight. Not just for his innocence, but for Myra's safety. And for the truth that someone powerful wanted to bury forever. Night fell quietly over the small cottage. But inside, Ethan could not sit still. His mind was full of questions, fear, and anger. Everything he once controlled was now out of his hands. For the first time in his life, he felt truly powerless. But even more than that, he felt something strange, something new. He realized he cared about what would happen to Myra, and her mother. Myra sat by the window, looking outside at the dark trees and the empty road. She seemed calm, but Ethan noticed her hands were shaking slightly. She was trying to hide it. Mrs. Lila prepared tea, trying to act normal, but the worry on her face was clear. Something bad was coming. They could all feel it. Ethan walked to the table and sat down. "Myra," he said softly, "you need to tell me the truth now. Why are those men after you too? What are you hiding?" Myra didn't look at him. Instead, she stared at her cup of tea. "It's not something I wanted to involve you in," she whispered. "But now, we don't have a choice." Her voice was almost trembling, but she forced herself to continue. "My father didn't die the way people think. He was part of a secret investigation against the men who stole your company. He found real proof of their crimes. But before he could expose them, they killed him. Or, at least everyone believes they did." Ethan froze. "What do you mean, believes?" Myra looked up at him. Her eyes were full of fear, but also bravery. "I think he's alive. And I think he's trying to reach me." A cold silence filled the room. Even Mrs. Lila stopped moving. Ethan leaned forward. "Myra, if this is true, why didn't you go to the police?" "We tried," Myra said. "But the police chief, he works for the same men. They told us to drop everything. After that, the threat started. My mother and I had to stay quiet. We worked for you because your house was the safest place for us." Ethan's breath caught. All this time, he thought Myra was just a quiet maid's daughter. But she had been. Living in fear, hiding secrets bigger than anything he had ever faced. Before he could speak, a loud thud hit the door. All three of them jumped. Mrs. Lila's hand shook, and the cup almost fell. Myra stood quickly. "They found us," she whispered. Ethan's heart raced. He moved quietly to the doorway and whispered, "Turn off the lights." The room went dark. They waited. Another thud. This time harder. Someone was trying to break in. Myra slowly reached under the table and pulled out a small metal box. Ethan stared. "What's that?" "It's what my father left for me," she answered. "His last message." Another loud bang hit the door, this time with enough force to shake the whole cottage. Ethan's voice turned sharp. "Open it, now." Myra took a deep breath and unlocked the box. Inside was a small flash drive, a folded paper, and a phone. Ethan grabbed the paper and opened it. At the top was a sentence. "If anything happens to me, give this to the one man powerful enough to expose them." At the bottom, in messy handwriting, was Ethan's name. "Ethan Holla." Ethan's eyes widened. "Why me?" "Because," Myra whispered, before he disappeared, "my father told me something. He said you were arrogant, rude, and selfish, but you were not corrupt. He believed you could still become a good man." Ethan felt something sharp inside his chest. He didn't know what to say, but he didn't get time to answer. The door finally gave in with a huge crash. Two men in dark coats stepped inside, holding weapons. Myra grabbed Ethan's hand and pulled him behind the kitchen counter. Mrs. Lila hid near the back door. The men whispered to each other as they walked deeper into the cottage. "Find the girl. She has it." Ethan whispered, "Give me the drive." Myra hesitated. "Ethan, give it to me," he repeated firmly. "They won't get it. I promise." She handed it to him, and Ethan hid it inside his shoe. Then he looked at her and said something he never imagined himself saying, "I won't let them hurt you." The men got closer. One opened the bedroom door. The other walked toward the kitchen. Myra took a deep breath and mouthed silently, "Run, when I say run." Ethan nodded. The men were only a few steps away. Myra suddenly grabbed a metal pot from the counter and threw it across the room. It hit the wall loudly. The men turned. "Over there! Run!" Myra shouted. Ethan grabbed her hand, and the two ran toward the back door. Mrs. Lila opened it quickly. They rushed out into the cold night as the attackers shouted behind them. The dark forest waited ahead. Myra didn't stop. Ethan didn't stop. They disappeared into the trees, running for their lives. Behind them, the men chased with flashlights and angry voices. Ethan looked at Mira as they ran. "Where are we going?" "To the only place they won't expect," she said breathlessly. "The place where my father left something else for us." "What place?" Ethan asked. Myra looked at him with fear and hope mixed in her eyes. His secret hideout. Ethan and Mira ran through the dark forest, the cold night air stinging their faces, their hearts pounding with every step. Behind them, the shouts of the men echoed like thunder, and the flashlights carved moving shadows across the trees. Ethan clutched the flash drive in his shoe, knowing it was the key to everything: his name, his freedom, his chance to stop the men who had ruined his life. Mira led the way, moving with a mix of urgency and familiarity, as if she had been here before, or somehow knew the forest like it was part of her own body. The small path twisted and turned through thick trees, fallen branches, and patches of mud, but neither of them slowed. Every now and then, Myra glanced back, making sure Ethan was keeping up, and his hand tightened around hers in silent reassurance. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached a small clearing where a hidden door was tucked behind thick vines and roots. Mira pushed it aside, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. Ethan's heart raced with both fear and hope. They descended slowly, carefully, until they entered a small underground room, lit dimly by a single lamp. The room smelled faintly of old books and metal, but it was empty of people, except for a table with documents, papers, and another folder marked with the words, "For Ethan Hawley." Myra pointed to it and whispered that this was her father's last gift, a collection of proof that would expose the men who had betrayed them both. Ethan picked up the folder and began to look through it. Each paper, each receipt, each signed document confirmed the story Myra had pieced together. Adrian Cross had forged his signature, stolen millions, and planned to destroy Ethan completely. But now, Ethan could fight back. He could prove he was innocent and finally bring justice to the people who had made their lives a nightmare. Mira watched him quietly, her eyes filled with relief and pride. For the first time, Ethan realized the truth. Myra hadn't just saved him from losing his fortune. She had saved him from losing himself. He had been proud, arrogant, and blind, but through her courage, he began to understand the meaning of loyalty, love, and trust. That night, they stayed in the hideout, planning their next moves. Ethan knew it wouldn't be easy. Adrian and his men were powerful, and the city would not welcome them easily. But he didn't care about money anymore. All that mattered was exposing the truth, protecting Myra and her mother, and reclaiming the life he wanted, not the one he had lost, but a better one. The next morning, they left the hideout cautiously, avoiding roads and towns until they reached the city outskirts. Ethan contacted an old friend, someone who had never abandoned him, someone he could trust to act quickly. They began to file reports, submit documents, and slowly, carefully, present the evidence that would prove his innocence. As the investigation reopened, Ethan watched with awe as the pieces fell into place. Adrian Cross was arrested, the forged documents exposed, and Hawley Industries returned to Ethan.